Asia program. Today's conference is one of several projects the Asia program is organizing dealing with food security themes. And on that note, I'd like to put in a plug for an early June event we're organizing on food security in Pakistan. You can pick up a flyer outside. It's going to be on June 3rd. The Asia program is one of 5 Wilson Center departments sponsoring today's event. The others are the Africa program, the Environmental Change and Security program, the Comparative Urban Studies project, and the program on Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy, which goes by shorthand STAGE. Thank you all for co-sponsoring, and I know that some of staff from those departments are around, so thank you all for your help. And speaking of thanks, there's also one particular individual I'd like to recognize, and that's my Asia program colleague, Sue Lee, seated in the front row. She'll be up here later this morning. Sue has been indispensable in helping put this event together, and without her great efforts, there would be no event today. So thank you, Sue. Since the height of the global food crisis last year, with increasing frequency, governments and investors have been acquiring farmland overseas. Governments, scared by high global grain prices and volatile commodities markets, have decided to take their country's food security needs into their own hands. Meanwhile, many investors see farmland as a good investment in an otherwise difficult financial climate. Now, the examples we hear about the most involve wealthy, food-importing, water-scarce nations, such as the Arab Gulf states and some of the rich countries of East Asia, investing in farmland in the poor nations of Africa and Southeast Asia. Now, it's unclear if these examples truly reflect the situation on the ground, though a French economist, whose name I won't try to pronounce, recently concluded that by the end of last year, 5 countries stood out for the amount of foreign arable land they had acquired. Countries he identified were China, South Korea, the UAE, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. Combined, he said, they control over 7.6 million cultivable hectares overseas, which is more than 5 times the usable agricultural surface of Belgium. Still, there are other manifestations of this land grab as well, though we hear less about them. For example, it's not just wealthy countries targeting the developing world. North African countries, like Egypt, are investing in sub-Saharan Africa. There are also cases of what you could call internal land grabbing. In Indonesia, Java-based companies are laying claim to land on the outer islands of Borneo and Sulawesi. Then there are what you could call the oil for food swaps. Libya and Ukraine have been working on a deal that would give Libya Ukrainian farmland and Ukraine a gas and oil contract in Libya. Additionally, for all the talk of how countries and investors are growing crops overseas purely to export them back home, there are also cases of investor countries growing crops for domestic markets. According to a new study by the International Institute for Environment and Development, there are about 24 Chinese egg farms in Zambia, and the eggs go to local markets. 15% of Lusaka's eggs come from these Chinese farms, the study says. What I personally find most striking about these overseas farmland deals is how they're both so promising and so risky at the same time. On the one hand, we've heard that the cure to high food prices is more agricultural productivity and higher farm yields in the developing world. Many believe that the land deals can help produce these outcomes by bringing foreign agricultural investment, new modern agricultural technology, and employment to host countries. But on the other hand, the farmland deals raise all kinds of troubling questions, particularly in terms of the impact on small farmers, their land, and their livelihoods. There are major political, security, and frankly ethical implications associated with countries and investors growing crops in impoverished countries and then whisking the crops right out of these host countries. And of course, there are a raft of environmental and legal concerns I won't even go into, though I'm confident that these will come up today. So ultimately, this can all be boiled down to food security. Can investing countries improve their own food security while also helping alleviate food insecurity in the host countries? My point here is that the land grab phenomenon is complex, often not presented in its full scope by the media. That said, this issue is getting a lot of media attention, though, in my view, more so in Europe and elsewhere than in this country. Different organizations, both here and abroad, are now researching the issue. Conferences are starting to be held, and this month alone, in addition to today's event, there will be 2 such events, one hosted by the 3D3 organization in Geneva on May 16, and another to be held later in May in Tanzania. So the objective today is to hear a variety of views on what's admittedly a multifaceted and controversial issue. We're fortunate to have assembled a talented group of speakers today representing experiences and opinions from across the board. So let me just review what's going to happen over the next few hours. After we hear the four presentations up here, we'll have a Q&A, and then we'll have a brief coffee break outside just after 11 at 11:05, and then we'll reconvene right here once again at 11:20 for the second panel. So let's get started, and you should have bios for all the speakers in front of you. So I'll be brief as I introduce each speaker before he or she gives their presentation. Our first speaker today is going to be David Hallam, who is Deputy Director for Trade and Markets Division at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO. He's held several other positions at FAO earlier on. Before coming to FAO, David was based at the University of Reading in the UK, where he served as Director of the Center for Agricultural Strategy and as a Senior Lecturer in Agricultural Economics. David?
Thank you very much, Michael. What I'm proposing to do in this presentation is just to give an overview of some of the issues which are involved, and to present what we think we know about these recent trends in investment, international investment in agriculture, particularly in terms of the famous land grab. So, to begin with, it's interesting that this has been very much a story picked up by the media, and it's got, really for a media story, it's got everything. It's got rich, wealthy countries investing in poor, food insecure countries and repatriating the food they produce, marginalization of smallholders. So it's got everything, and I put together just a few headlines which we've been monitoring over the last year or so, which tells many aspects of the story. The other thing which is kind of interesting about these headlines, and one of the things that makes it difficult to work in this area, is that many of them are actually misleading or false, or turned out to be untrue. But we have the whole story here. The Saudi investors investing in Africa. We've got the South Korean companies allegedly buying half of Madagascar's agricultural land. And of course, all these stories provoked a response, which was to brand this as neo-colonialism. Not least by our Director General, I should say. And I've spent a lot of the last year kind of picking up the pieces after that. And then, as we see through these headlines, there's been a progressive growing of concern about these investments. So, what I will do then, I'll just review what we know, or think we know, about the recent investments. I'll then look at the motivations for these. What's driving these investments? Are they a new phenomenon, or are they just a continuation of past foreign direct investment kind of trends? Then I'll look at what appears to be the impact, or what are the bases for the concerns which people have about these investments. And then finally, I'll look at some policy implications and some outstanding issues in the area about how we go forward. So first, the trends and patterns. I'm going to focus on investment for agricultural production, especially food production. I'm not going to say very much about biofuel investments, which are another important area but raise some slightly different issues. Now, as I said, this is an area that's been very much documented by the media, and unfortunately, Often it's the media, only the media stories which we have to go on from the world's business press to decide what is actually happening. In FAO, we also, of course, have our network of country representatives who feed back information to us as well. But the information in this area is very patchy. The international statistics on investment, foreign investment, are really too aggregated to pick up much of the detail of what is going on. We are undertaking, together with colleagues in UNCTAD and now the World Bank also, a series of country case studies to try and find out just what is happening on the ground, what is the nature of these investments, what are the impacts. But that work is ongoing, and but some of the things that I'll say about what appears to be the trends are based on that kind of information. We hope that this year we'll have a firmer basis for looking at these investments, because UNCTAD's World Investment Report this year, the special theme is agricultural investments, and particularly these recent developments. As I mentioned, there's not much information in this area, and a lot of the information which is available in the end turns out to be not very accurate. A lot of the press stories, for example, present investments as done deals, when in fact all that's happening is that there's a delegation visiting, or there's a plan or something. So it's really quite difficult to get at what is actually happening. Now, of course, there's always been international investment in agriculture, going back over many, many years. So what is different about these investments? What is new? Rather like many of the past investments, they tend to be resource-seeking investments. They're not market-seeking investments, they're resource-seeking investments. The idea being to produce food to repatriate. It does appear that since the alleged world food crisis that there is an upturn in these kind of investments, motivated by the food security concerns of resource-poor countries. And of course, this upsurge in investment has been characterized as the land grab, because most of the investments have been in agricultural land, either in terms of acquisition through purchase or long leases. So, who are doing these investments? Well, it's a whole range of different investors involved here. The private sector predominates, and I think this is something again which perhaps the press coverage tends not to indicate, which is that, you know, we see Saudi Arabia is investing in Ethiopia. Well, it's Saudi Arabian companies which are investing in Ethiopia, not necessarily the Saudi Arabian government. And the investors in the private sector are agribusiness to some extent, but also investment companies, trading houses, and so on. Governments are involved, and it becomes complicated where government funding is being channeled through the private sector, but there is government involvement. And also there is the involvement of the sovereign wealth funds, especially in the Gulf states. And at the beginning of this story, the sovereign wealth funds were identified as being key players. I think all of our evidence that we've collected so far suggests that although they are involved, they are not perhaps as important as they were made out to be. In terms of which countries are doing the investments, especially the Gulf states, China is a major investor, South Korea we've mentioned, and then lower down the list you have countries like Japan and so on. The destination of these investment flows has been very much Africa, and particular countries within Africa, Sudan, for example, Ethiopia have been particular targets, but really throughout Africa. I do detect from discussions recently with investors and a number of other people that the emphasis on Africa is weakening. And certainly there's a greater interest now in Latin America. And a number of countries, of course, have made it clear that they would like to run down or scale down their involvement in Africa. Partly, I think this is a result of much of the adverse publicity which has been attracted by these investments, the neocolonialism, the land grab, and so on. Land acquisitions do predominate. There are other forms of investments as well which continue, which are perhaps more like the traditional foreign direct investment. Some of these land acquisitions are extremely large, and many of them are in excess of 10,000 hectares, so very significant. The investments are targeted mainly at producing food, basic foods. This is another difference from more traditional foreign direct investment in agriculture, if you like, which is in the past has emphasized export products like coffee, bananas, and so on. So this is another slight difference. So the kind of investments that we've seen, well, land acquisition I've mentioned, and there are hundreds of stories in the media about that. For example, the Emirates and their investments in Pakistan, Africa, and so on. There's also other forms of investment which are going on, though, things like contract farming and outgrower schemes. The horticultural developments in East Africa are similar to that. We've then got a continuing traditional foreign direct investment. A number of countries, Heinz investing in tomato production in Egypt, Chiquita in Mozambique, and so on. And then we've got mixed models where you have large-scale investments accompanied by kind of satellite smallholder outgrower systems. And so some of the sugar industry in southern and East Africa is like that. I should say, though, that this acquisition of assets and operation of assets to produce directly is rather against the trend in foreign direct investment in agriculture. In recent years, there's been a movement away from direct production and towards looser forms of vertical integration, contract farming, and so on. So why is it happening? Well, it depends a little bit on which investors we're talking about, whether it's private sector or it's government and so on. And as I said before, the motivations overlap a lot. The big thing which is driving the recent upsurge does appear to be food security concerns following the world food crisis and the high food price episode. If you talk to investors in the Gulf, then what concerned them particularly about the recent developments on world food markets was not so much the high food prices. These are wealthy countries, they can pay those. What they were particularly concerned about was the fact that a number of key exporters imposed export restrictions, which meant that at any price, food supplies were less available. And so there was this questioning in the minds of some of these import-dependent countries about how reliable international markets were as a source of supply. And of course, the WTO disciplines on things like export restrictions are really quite weak. Other motivations I've mentioned, biofuel production. We've also seen a number of investments which are basically portfolio diversification. Investing in agricultural land is not a bad option at the moment. Okay, so why does it appear that poor countries in Africa and elsewhere have their arms wide open for this kind of investment, and they're promising all kinds of wonderful conditions to attract that investment? The first thing to say is that one of the key problems facing developing country agriculture over decades has been a lack of investment. And so there is investment needed in order to raise productivity, production, and so on. Our colleagues back home in Rome, in FAO, have been estimating investment requirements in order to meet the target of halving the number of hungry people by, well, the date moves from time to time, but It's estimated that at least $30 billion per year is needed, additional investment, in order to meet the various hunger targets. The latest estimates put those that figure quite a bit higher. So there is a need for investment. What about what other general benefits does this bring to developing countries? First of all, the financial benefits of asset transfers are quite small, it would appear. In many cases, it seems that land is being offered on concessional terms, or reportedly even free in some cases. But the advantages which countries see in these investments are some of the broader developmental benefits: technology transfer, employment creation, linkages into the domestic economy, and of course infrastructural developments. Many of these investments involve infrastructural investment as well, construction of port facilities, roads, rail, and so on, which is a crucial limitation on developing country agricultural productivity, especially in Africa. I mentioned briefly the need for investment funds, and this is interesting where these private sector investments come in. If you think of where investment resources are going to come from, typically developing countries have got limited budgetary resources. The private sector in developing countries has not had a good record in terms of investment. These graphs show overseas development assistance going to agriculture, and you can see, perhaps not very clearly, but the proportion, the lower diagram shows the proportion of total official development assistance going to agriculture over many years. And you can see that it's fallen from up to 13% right down to about 5% now. And you can argue about what is classed as agriculture and not, but the trends are probably about right. So there is this gap between the investment needs of developing country agriculture and what is coming from other sources. So here is potentially a role for international private sector investments. So what is the impact of these investments, though? If there is this clear role, why are people so concerned about them? Well, there are, as Michael mentioned in his introduction, there's economic, political, social, ethical concerns surrounding these investments. They've been branded as neocolonialism. So if they're branded as neocolonialism, how can we try and turn them into something which is much more positive? How can we try and match up this wish to invest with the investment needs of developing countries so that we get the proverbial win-win situation rather than neocolonialism? As I mentioned, there are a number of potential positive impacts of these investments, and they're listed again here. Technology transfer, upgrading of production processes, employment creation, multiplier effects, income and employment generation, and so on. So there are some potentially positive benefits. So I think in general, we shouldn't perhaps immediately put up our defenses and say, we don't want these investments because of the nature of them. The question is, how do you turn these investments into something which is productive and useful? Having mentioned the positive effects, of course, we're all very familiar with the negative effects too. And you can imagine a worst-case scenario where you get some wealthy foreign country investing or acquiring land, large areas of land in a poor, food-insecure developing country, imposing a model of agricultural production which is capital-intensive, chemical-intensive, perhaps based on imported inputs, perhaps also environmentally damaging. It's easy to see in those situations that the impact is going to be negative. Now, the record on foreign direct investment in agriculture over the years does unfortunately suggest that many of those concerns are well-founded. A review of the literature on the impacts of foreign direct investment in agriculture leaves us with some unease, and at least not a conviction that there are definitely positive effects to be had. Now, if the task is to turn these investments into something which leads to the win-win situations, what is necessary? Well, most of the onus of actions to attract investment and to make sure it meets the requirements of developing countries, it meets their investment needs and has positive developmental benefits, the onus for that falls very much on developing countries, on the host countries, rather than the investing countries. Many of the developing countries have been opening up their economies to foreign investment over the last few years. Bilateral investment agreements, investment promotion authorities, and so on. So they've been working hard on this. Of course, many foreign investors would still see, especially African countries, as a risky investment environment. And so it's important to establish a more conducive investment climate as well. That does not mean to say, basically, as we've seen reported, various ministers around agriculture promising anything in order to get investments in. But nevertheless, more could perhaps be done. Though if we are going to get the win-win situation, then there are a number of concerns which national legislation, national policies need to ensure, and I've listed a few of these here. Obviously, consistency with the food security strategy of the country, the needs of and interests of stakeholders who maybe are currently occupying and operating land, and how will we deal with those? Will we absorb them into the investments, compensate them, or what? So there are a number of policy aspects there which need to be addressed. Some of these issues have been feeding across into the idea of an international code of conduct to govern these investments. There are some international codes of conduct and codes of voluntary codes of responsibility which do apply or could be extended in this area. Perhaps none are exactly appropriate, but the kind of elements that an international code of conduct might contain would be aspects concerning transparency, governance issues, stakeholder consultation, sustainability, and so on. And I'm sure that Ruth later in the morning will talk a little bit about IFPRI's work down that route. Let me finish by looking at some outstanding issues which we're looking at within FAO. The first concerns investing countries. Their motivation is primarily food security. As I mentioned, these kind of investments, though, are contrary to what we've been seeing in foreign direct investment more generally. And when I've asked investors, especially in the Gulf countries, why this preoccupation with acquiring land, with all of the political and economic problems that presents, their answer is always security. Now, it seems to me that having some kind of land deal of the type we've seen does not make you immune from sovereign risk. If there's a domestic food crisis in the country that's concerned, I find it unlikely that national politicians would say, fine, take all of this food out of the country. It does seem to me, therefore, that other forms of investment, other business models could offer just as much security and at the same time have much more positive developmental benefits for the host country. As far as the host countries are concerned, as I've said, the key there is not so much to say no to these investments perhaps, but rather to make sure that the policy and legislative framework is in place to make sure that they maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. A lot of developing countries are ill-equipped to actually put those kind of legislative and policy frameworks in place. So there's a need to establish best practice and to share information on those issues. Then I've mentioned already international regulations, codes of conduct. This could be an important direction to go in. And then finally, just to one last point, the key here is that on the one hand, we have investment, very, very substantial investment needs in developing country agriculture. More conventional sources of resources to fund those investment needs are lacking. So here is potentially a role for international investment. At the same time, there is obviously a willingness on the part of international investors to invest in developing country agriculture. Question is, how do we match those two up? What steps do we need to take to make sure that those two match up for the benefit of all? Clearly, a first step is that developing country agriculture investment needs need to be catalogued, almost like a shopping list, and matched up with the investment funds flowing from investing countries through information sharing, investment promotion, and so on. That seems to me to be the key task to be undertaken at the moment. Well, I don't think you need to know why FAO is working on this, so we can skip that one. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was a very good and comprehensive overview to the topic. While our next speaker is getting her presentation situated, let me just mention a few things that I failed to mention before. I wanted to extend a special welcome to the webcast audience. We're webcasting this event live around the world on the Wilson Center website. So thank you all for watching us this morning, or actually I guess it could be this afternoon or evening where you are. Another thing that I failed to mention, all of the presentations that you're going to be hearing today, all 7 of them, will be published as a paper, as a edited volume in the next few months. So as long as you've signed in and we have your contact information, you'll be sure to get a copy when it's available in the fairly near future. Finally, if everyone could please turn off any cell phones, pagers, or Blackberries, anything of that like, that would be much appreciated. Our next speaker is going to be Alexandra Spieldoch, who is Director of the Trade and Global Governance Program at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, based in Minnesota. She has published research and popular education materials on international policy from human rights and development perspectives. She previously coordinated the Secretariat for the International Gender and Trade Network and co-directed the Global Women's Project at the Center of Concern.
Good morning. I thought it would be warmer in Washington, D.C. than it is in Minnesota, but apparently I was wrong. It's an honor to follow Mr. Hallam and to be able to perhaps say some similar things, but also to add some more layers in terms of the social costs of overseas land acquisition. I want to start by talking about our current food insecurity situation. As many of you know, there are 963 million people that are food insecure today, and that's over 100 million more than the count was in 2006, so the number has been growing. And this is a major setback to hunger eradication and also to commitments that governments made as part of their of the Millennium Development Goals to have hunger and poverty, that they made in 2000. There, as has been mentioned, there's interest from governments and firms that is for long-term leases and ownership of land abroad, and we can all agree that investment is urgently needed. So land acquisition is another form of investment that's now being promoted. As has been mentioned as well, not all of the land acquisitions have resulted in signed contracts. A number of them are still under negotiation, and others have fallen apart because of adverse reactions in certain countries or because money has fallen through in the midst of the global financial crisis. Yet, clearly, this trend around land acquisition is growing, a growing number of reports, and this merits our attention in terms of looking at the social implications. Now, as Mr. Hallam mentioned, there are a number of the multilateral institutions are reviewing this trend and seeking to weigh in. So IFPRI has just released a new report, and Ruth can say more about this. The FAO has commissioned some pieces. The World Bank is publishing codes of conduct, and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier Duscuter, has announced plans to go to Madagascar in May for a particular mission to look at the implications of land acquisition in the context of the right to food. So we're here to talk about what are the different factors that need to be considered. And clearly there's a need for investment. The question really is for whom and for what. And land grabbing raises real questions relating to ownership, access, and control, and as well as the particular implications for land and for people. And I feel that we often need to come back to this particular point, that we're talking about existing problems that we already have with land, as well as future problems, and existing problems that we have with food security and with poverty alleviation, as well as future problems. So it's not just a conversation about markets, but a conversation about international development needs and goals. Land acquisition is not new, and this has been mentioned that in the current context there's a lot of reference to neo-colonialism. In fact, we saw colonization of farmland by foreign settlers or through taxation by remote rulers. Since before the Roman Empire, there was a huge wave of colonization in the 19th century, European powers into the different regions of Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. And one of the clear sort of ways to describe that experience is that the colonizers appropriated much of the fertile land for themselves and pushed local populations into marginal land for their own production. And so while the colonial estates and the cash economies created some employment, investment was also diverted from production of staple foods for local populations. In more recent history, as has been mentioned, we've seen other kinds of land acquisition in terms of land investment for tourism, contract farming to supply transnational markets and food processing firms, investment in natural resource extraction, and there are many reports on the fierce battles over control of resources in these examples, as well as the displacement of persons for these kinds of investments. Now, it has been mentioned that what we're talking about in particular now, the current trends have a particular characteristic in terms of outsourcing basic food or food staples. And the other sort of interesting aspect of this current trend is that it's not really a north to south pattern, as we've seen with some of the historical investment, but it's very much the fact that a number of developing countries are investing abroad. India has soybean projects in Brazil. China has an estimated 23 farms in Zambia, and Mauritius has an understanding with Mozambique to produce food for both local and regional markets. So there are different characteristics of the acquisitions, and there are different considerations to look at. Now, here are some more examples, and I won't go into them. IFPRI has a whole list of the different ventures that are out there, as do some other NGOs, but perhaps the third bullet point, the Gulf Cooperation Council, that includes Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, is of particular importance to this discussion because of the clear investment strategy to outsource food production, particularly in countries like Sudan and Pakistan, but also in some other regions such as Southeast Asia and Africa and Eastern Europe. it is not my job today to talk about the push factors related to land acquisition, but it was a fun chance to offer some graphics. Just to liven things up, but clearly the food security issue is quite relevant. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, who lack arable land and fresh water, are seeking production elsewhere and using their capital to do so. And this is a clear concern for perhaps not just the current food security question, but also future food security. And then, of course, another group of investors that are motivated by the biofuels as a significant source of demand for agricultural commodities. And there are numerous examples of that, in particular, many of the European firms that are investing in Africa. And has also been mentioned by Mr. Hallam, new markets for investors in the midst of unstable markets, in the midst of a financial crisis. Land becomes more interesting. What do countries hope to gain? Well, clearly, many of the points that have been raised, this includes building infrastructure for some key and very important things, such as new roads and port facilities, access to research and technology, credit for markets where capital is scarce, and ideally investment would also be used to support existing local food systems and to promote a fair price for local producers. And from a development perspective, the end result should provide smallholder farmers with more choices and more access and more control. Now, I think I was probably asked here largely to talk about the risks, social costs risks, in the same category, and I have many. One is the potential for lopsided power relationships between investors and host countries, where you see, not in all cases, but large-scale investors seeking to invest in the host countries, many of whom are quite poor. Some are involved already in civil war. For example, Sudan and intermittently Ethiopia have their own conflicts. Others are politically unstable, as we've seen with Madagascar and Zimbabwe and Pakistan. And few of the host states are able to govern with strong and independent democratic institutions. So this raises the whole question of how these investments are in fact viable. Similarly, these host governments may or may not, based on their internal structure, have the same point of view. Different ministries may be involved in the discussions or in the negotiations, but not all. And there are different aspects of how government works, from the federal to the state and to the local level. So the question is, to what degree all of the appropriate authorities are involved in the negotiation process, and to what degree their different points of view are represented in the investment, in the ventures. Perhaps there's also a lack of information and transparency, and that deals are happening outside of the democratic processes. And this really needs further review as well. There are more risks, and that has to do with land being diverted from communities, where there are assumptions about marginal and unused land that could misrepresent their needs. What the host government might categorize as wasteland that could be open for foreign acquisition might very well be meeting an important share of rural people's household needs, especially in the poorest households, and especially at times of economic shock, which many developing countries are experiencing. So-called marginal land is also used for grazing as a source of wild foods and medicinal plants, and for access to water. And in many of these cases, smallholder producers have a very little voice in terms of the investment that's taking place. Now, there are more risks. Some of the targeted countries receive food aid and are not in a position to refuse investment. And, for example, some of the countries that are receiving food aid from the World Food Program include Cambodia, Niger, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Burma. And these countries are living with extreme levels of food insecurity and need investment in their domestic production to regain their autonomy. And at the same time, the countries are among the world's poorest countries and not in a position to refuse investment, even if the terms are not ideal. So investment that is clearly anchored in a wider development strategy is very important. And net food importing countries need to move away from this kind of dependence on food handouts and to establish their own autonomy at the national level. And this is quite critical at this time. Now, different countries have already instituted or are still in the process of implementing land tenure reform, and in some cases after brutal wars or political systems such as apartheid in South Africa. So the legacy of land dispossession relates to national identity, reconciliation, justice, and government legitimacy, and this is not easily resolved throughout history. And I think it will be these will be clear challenges with current forms of land acquisition. Political conflict has been mentioned, so I won't say too much over this. But again, there have been violent disputes over land over time, and the latest round of land deals have provoked some violent protests. And for example, the proposed deal between the South Korean firm Daewoo and Madagascar now seems to have fallen apart. But this deal provoked a significant outcry from the public in an already unstable political situation, and this contributed to the government toppling. Now, there are investments that are offered by host governments as well that are problematic and need to be looked at, and these include amending national laws to attract foreign investors that may in fact discriminate against smallholder producers, tax incentives for investors, and for example, Pakistan is offering companies the right to repatriate 100% of their profits. The Madagascar Daewoo deal would have essentially removed tax restrictions as well for the 99 years of the proposed duration of the lease. And we also see that there are few to no performance requirements for many of these investment measures, as well as relaxed regulatory oversight. So what are we really talking about when we refer to a win-win situation? I think it really raises some questions. Now, of course, it goes without saying the number of smallholder producers are the most vulnerable, that they tend to be policy takers rather than policy makers, and this is certainly not to detract from their clear leadership and resiliency and vibrant communities, but just to sort of show that they are in fact the most vulnerable. They have the least political voice. They're often the least well organized among themselves. They don't have common interests necessarily. Some may be in a position to benefit while others not. And they lack bargaining power, along with many other things, credit and access to markets, etc. They're already stressed by extreme hunger and poverty in the current situation. So to what degree will we improve their situation or make it worse? Now, it's important to have some kind of a gender component because we know that women are the majority of smallholder producers in developing countries. They seldom possess legal land rights. They are responsible for growing food, to not only growing food, but also they are the food providers for their families. And while they may have customary rights to land, they seldom have the formal legal rights. They're often just discriminated against in formal and customary systems of land tenure. And their ability to claim legal rights and to participate in institutions and political activities are limited. They often lack the resources and, again, looking at credit and technology, etc. Women are also increasingly working for wages on many of the plantations or the commodity processing factories. So this includes growing and processing vegetables. We've seen that in South Africa, or cut flowers in Ecuador, or bananas in Central America. And while these jobs create jobs create for women, while women are seeing some job creation within the agricultural sector, there are also cases where women are working in more temporary, low-paid, and insecure jobs. This is reinforcing discrimination and also marginalizing women. Now, land degradation is another key area, and we know that it affects more than 900 million people worldwide, as much as 2/3 of the world's agricultural land, and that we're also looking at clear problems related to water scarcity that could be exacerbated by new trends in land acquisition or could be dealt with. Now, moving forward, because I think I'm talking for quite a long time, I'm prone to do that. Articulated investment in agriculture that leaves space for local priorities, I think, is absolutely critical. And some of you may know about the International Assessment for Agricultural Knowledge, Science, and Technology for Development, the ISTAD. This was signed by 58 governments. It reflects a growing consensus there were 400 contributors to this process, and it reflects a growing consensus that we need investment, but we need appropriate investment. And we need investment that prioritizes multifunctionality in agriculture, that gives preference to ecological sustainability, the leadership of producers, including women, the development and use of local seed varieties and farmers' abilities to save seeds, and reliable access and collective engagement in agricultural value chains. Now, we also need to be looking at land use and land availability as well as land rights, and I probably don't need to say much here. But again, we need to assess who owns the land. Is it the government or corporation or an individual? How does this change the power dynamic within that particular country? Is the land being sold easily? Is there some kind of external pressure to sell the land? And what are the implications of this? Also need to look at land use in terms of population growth, because clearly we can see already that the projected population growth is quite high in the next 40 years, and this will have, trying to think about future implications is quite important as we see our resources decreasing. Food security first. According to the FAO, food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. It goes without saying that governments should be enacting measures to prioritize food security and to develop national food plans, and have been doing so. But to what degree are these efforts being undermined by current land acquisition trends? Now, adopt a rights-based approach to guide investment. This is me, the NGO, talking to you now. As many of you know, the U.S. has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and therefore it's a difficult discussion to have in terms of supporting a right-to-food agenda in the U.S. But my position and that of many out there is that we should be using the rights-based framework to guide our policymaking, and this includes restricting policies, restricting corporations from being able to impinge on the right to food, and to allow for free, prior, informed consent and full disclosure, that these are clear points within human rights, legal ideology, and commitments, and we should not be forgetting about these. Ensure broad-based engagement in the various guidelines and best practice codes, and I think Ruth will say a lot more about all of this. And finally, we're all holding up the world. We have a responsibility. It's not minor, and we can do it right or we can do it wrong, but we're all in it together. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. Let's move on to our third presentation, and it's going to be from Gary Blumenthal, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of World Perspectives. He joined the organization in 1994 after working for 14 years with the U.S. government, and his positions included Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Special Assistant to the President for Agricultural Trade and Food Assistance, and Deputy Assistant to the President for Cabinet Affairs. And he's also worked for Congress and for the U.S. Air Force as well. And in a group of speakers that comes from, I think, 3 different continents, Gary comes from the exotic locale of essentially downstairs in the Ronald Reagan building. So he had a very easy trip. So.
Weird. Sorry, we had the presentation on here. We don't know where it went. Actually, it should be on the desktop. While we're getting started, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to let you bring that up. While we're getting started, let me preface, how when you're dealing with stock analysts, they always start with a disclaimer. So here's my disclaimer. We don't trade. We don't lobby. We don't own farmland. My wife's family farms in Kansas, but they've seen what I can do to a suburban lawn, and they've assured me I'm going nowhere near their business. what we do is we do market analysis, and I will say that we have provided guidance. Yes, is that it? It must be it. What do you know? To investment funds interested in farmland overseas. Thank you. Just for overview, I always like to start. Well, what is it from an investor's standpoint? What are they thinking? And of course, they usually look for two different things. One is, what's the really unique thing? What is the really great idea that hasn't been done before? Sort of like the Steve Jobs iPod. And that's really cool when you can deliver something that you didn't even know you needed. The other, and this is the more typical investment approach, which is you're trying to find where you can extract some efficiency out of the system. And it's usually, they're very focused. I was at an investors conference on solar energy, and they weren't buying solar companies. They were looking for how to solve the most minute problem individually all over the whole solar technology system. So that's typically the way they look at it. I think one thing I've concluded is that investors are very visionary people. They have conviction because we do the risk analysis side, so we're always coming out with all these horror stories. Well, this could happen and that could happen, and then they ignore us and invest anyway. So they definitely have more moxie than I do. David had mentioned investment in agriculture, and if we just look at a piece that was done by the European Journal on Agricultural Economics, the graph on the right, they tallied up foreign direct investment over an 8-year period, and in food and agriculture, basically about 10% of all the investment that went in manufacturing around the world went to food processing. So 90% went elsewhere. And if we look at just production agriculture, it was 0.06% of all FDI went to production agriculture. Now, that's obviously changed, and that's the purpose of this conference, but just to put in perspective that this has not exactly been a great idea for investing in the past. Just some of the historical biases, and they've been mentioned, and the first one I'll mention is small is good, and we see this social pushback to these huge acreages or hectares that we see being bought up and invested in. I had a discussion with an official at the World Bank, and I said, agriculture is about scale. We can see it. That if you really want to increase your productivity, you need to have the scale in order to do the investment and the technology application, et cetera. So why is the World Bank and all these other multilateral institutions always talking about helping subsistence agriculture? And I thought what he would say is, well, because that's what these developing country leaders are telling us. Is, they've got a severe political situation, but that's not what he said. He said, well, that's what our donor countries are telling us to do. Donor countries. That's what the rich countries are telling them to do. And so what's going on in the rich countries? Well, I was struck, of course, we've got the Obama administration came out and they said, well, we want to stop farm supports to farms that have more than $500,000 in gross sales. I got to tell you, in American agriculture, $500,000 is not much in gross sales. And it prompted a representative from the American Farm Bureau Federation that represents, of course, farmers to say at the USDA Outlook conference recently, he started out, he said, corporate agriculture, factory farming, agribusiness. He said you have to say those terms with a sneer because that's sort of the way, it's viewed. And yet, this is really, if we're going to feed 9 billion people, there are many of us that believe that's what it's going to take. I will tell you that we do farmer surveys. I ask farmers, okay, how much do you plant on now? And then I ask them, if money were no object, how much land would you like to plant on? And inevitably, it's 2 and 3 times the amount of land they currently have. You could ask that of any farmer anywhere in the world, and I guarantee they want a bigger farm than they have now. And that's why we have consolidation, and another reason why we have consolidation. It's been mentioned that historically, land grab has been a problem. If you can see that Time magazine, I don't think you can see the date maybe, It says the foreign land grab scare. That may be where Michael got the title for the conference. But I had to look twice. It's from 1979. So it could be from 2009. Of course, originally back in the 1800s, we worried about the Europeans coming in and buying land. Then in the 1900s, it was the Japanese and the Chinese that we were xenophobic about. More recently, in the 1970s, it was the Arabs and the Japanese. I was really struck. I was reading back an old quote from Tom Harkin. He's still around, but back then he said, "Why, those Arab sheikhs could take all that oil money and buy every acre of farmland in Iowa." And of course, they didn't. There was a California assemblyman, and he told one newspaper reporter that thousands and thousands of acres in California were being bought by foreigners. And so the reporter pressed him and says, well, please tell me, where are these acres? Show them to me. And the assemblyman came up with one farm. And it turned out to be a farm that was bought by an American of Iranian descent. But somehow he turned it into thousands. Since 1979, we've had a requirement that foreign investors register any farmland ownership here in the U.S., and the way it's structured, well, I will tell you that over time it's generally been about 1%, no matter what, 1%. Half of it is forest land, not even agricultural production land, a big chunk of it in Maine, and a big chunk of it owned by Canadians. And the reason why you get sort of the number even 1% is because a chunk of it is corporate owned, and if you have more than 10% of your shareholders as foreigners, then therefore it's foreign owned farmland. So we've got all kinds of skewing in the numbers there. But one thing we know, Al-Qaeda is not buying farmland. Of course, as an investor, you look at what are the fundamentals, what's driving this, and we know we've got great demand for food. We've got stocks falling, prices rising, at least as we're told. From an investor standpoint, this is a good hedge against inflation. It's a diversification of your portfolio, and basically capital flows to where it gets a good return. So that's why, and I will say, having lived through agriculture when there was no capital flowing into it, this is a much better situation. Then we look at, okay, well, what are investors hearing from our policymakers? The G8 agriculture ministers meeting a couple weeks ago in Treviso, Italy, would they say, well, we need more investment, both public and private. So there's some encouragement there. And then the policymakers are sitting there and they're pumping demand for more crops to go into biofuels. Almost half the increase in corn demand in recent years has been because of ethanol. Then we're getting warnings. Climate change is going to make agriculture very difficult, and therefore we're hearing prices are going to rise. And again, this is beckoning the investor, saying, whoa, we got a big thing going on here. And I think as we probably heard from David that, we've got official development assistance is going down. If we just looking at Africa, agriculture is the biggest industry in Africa, and yet those governments on average put just 5% of their spending into agriculture. So if the policymakers are saying we have to do something here, and yet they're not really doing anything, that's telling the private investor, well, okay, this door needs to be walked through. Okay, so what do we look at? We look at factors of production. And so there's the physical capital, the land, water, financial capital, human capital, and then, of course, geopolitical risk. And we all like maps. These are the soil regions of the world. If you look at those green areas, those are absolutely, your best soils, and you can see right up through the middle of the United States, across the southern border of the former Soviet Union, a little bit down in Brazil, and those are all very good areas to invest in. About 10 to 13% of all the land areas are considered arable, but of course, as any agronomist will tell you, not all soils are considered equal. One thing, okay, there's the circles around. Now you can see it better. of course, energy and agriculture is intertwined, and you can absolutely produce crops in just about anywhere else. But what happens is the amount of supplementation you have to do in order to produce a good crop goes up, and that becomes very correlated to energy costs. And so you have to weigh those two when you're looking at land. Then, of course, moisture. And if we look at this map, water, of course, is the issue du jour. And we've got acute shortages right there where the populations are growing the fastest across the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, I think the figure is that 60% of all the water is already subscribed in these areas, mostly to agriculture. And so we have quite a water problem. But meanwhile, if you look at those green areas, they generally have very good moisture. Again, the United States, Brazil, or Latin America across, again, that southern border of the former Soviet Union. Now, you know, if you were an alien, if you came to Earth from Mars, and you heard all these humans running around saying, I'm worried about water, I'm worried about water. And they'd look, well, you got to be kidding me. 4/5 of the world is water. What's the problem? And, of course, the problem is that water isn't where we need it to be. And it is very costly to put irrigation systems in. And what's very interesting here is that if you look at where irrigation is most prevalent, it's India and China. China with about 55% of its area irrigated, and India 90%. This has taken basically a strong central government push to happen because the economics weren't there from a private sector standpoint. But you know, certainly if all the predictions are true, then we would say, you know, you might want to invest in irrigation companies if we're going to have problems due to climate change. I'd also say probably Russia and Canada are probably pretty good places to invest under climate change, if that's true. Okay, let's move on. One thing that we often get asked is, okay, well, what about livestock? And the reason being is that as people get richer, the first place they put money is into increasing their protein consumption. It's the one macronutrient in which most people are undernourished in. And so we would look at, well, where's livestock production occurring? Those red areas, by the way, on this map, those are CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. Of course, CAFOs still require a great deal of pasture or crop production to feed those animals. But one of the interesting things is just how rapidly China is concentrating its animal production. Okay, so if we look at the capital assessment, financial capital, of course, that's what investors bring to the game. Not very much needed in the United States. Our farmers are basically 9.1% debt-to-asset ratios. That's remarkable. For any industry in any country, they're capital flush. But as we know, and has been mentioned, it's needed in many other parts of the world. The one thing we always run into, of course, is that developing countries, they say, well, we have lots of cheap labor. Well, you know, technology trumps labor. It's really going to depend on the crop, the cost of the technology versus the cost of the labor. And abundant labor is not necessarily a benefit. It can be, but it's very, very dependent on these other factors. And we tend to look at human capital from the standpoint, okay, well, is it educated? How educated is it? How capable is it of managing farming operations? And very particularly is what's the culture? This is probably, you know, one of the most imponderables because what is the entrepreneurial spirit here to actually get things done? I put that chart up because it just reinforces that agriculture is about scale. Some people would say, well, you know, correlation is not causation, and maybe it's just strange irony. But if we look at number of farmers per hectare, or hectares per farmer, generally the more farmers per hectare of land, the poorer the nutrition, the poorer the health care, the lower the education. the elephant in the room is the big social problem in the world, that we have got to move all this excess agricultural labor out of it. And I'll take my hat off to China, because China's figured it out. China's goal basically is to move this excess labor into industry and services and whatnot. Okay, so geopolitical risk. This is just taking the Association of Foreign Real Estate Investors data. Now, they're general real estate investment, so this is not going to be agricultural investment, but I think one of the things that comes through here is that absolutely, of course, there's great confidence in your rich countries because they have governance, rule of law. You have a sense that the contracts that you sign for real estate are going to be upheld through a judicial system. And so they rank very high in terms of investment. Maybe not for agricultural land, but just to give you a sense of how geopolitical risk comes out. If you look at the bottom chart, and this probably gets a little more into what we're interested in agriculture, and you can see the BRIC countries show up very high, or Turkey because of its relationship to Europe, or Mexico to the U.S. This is just a quick graphic just to show where certainly our little documentation about where investment is going, and I think David mentioned Africa, but we've seen an awful lot into Russia, Ukraine as well. It changes over time. And one thing I don't think should be ignored here, and that's risks to investors. As I said, we try to point this out to certainly our clients, and then how do they manage it. And if we just look at volatility in agriculture, investment bankers are accustomed to income rising 7% a year, 9% a year, and then we show them an agricultural price track that is pretty hazardous. And as we can see just from last year to this year, all this interest in investing in land, and this year prices are pretty well fallen in half. And in fact, if we look at the forecast, they're generally going to stay lower. If we look at the track history of prices, troughs tend to last longer. The last trough we had lasted 19 years. The one before that, 11 years. That's a long time to go with low prices in your main production. Then we look at what's expansion capacity. When you have all this money flowing into land, into productivity, there's bound to be a supply response. If you ask a U.S. corn farmer what his biggest concern is right now, it's that the technology providers are correct, and corn production is going to go from 150 bushels per acre on average to 300 bushels. And that, again, spells trouble for an investor in land. Asset depreciation, if a commodity falls in price one year, it usually comes back the following year. When you have an asset price drop, it took us 20 years to come back after the 30% fall in farmland values in the 1980s. And you can't hedge for it the way you can with commodity risk. So that's another hazard. I would say the historical record we have heard, those of us who've been in agriculture for many years, each time they say, well, this time it's different. This is a new era. But we see the cycle repeated, so we're a little skeptical. And then just to mention the politics of this has been mentioned by other panelists, and David's boss, who says basically the purchase of foreign farmland is a hot potato. With that, I'll just say that, from our standpoint, it's going to take investment. It's going to take capital investment. It's going to take private money for us to meet the nutrition needs of 9 billion people of where we're headed. It's not going to be possible to promise food to everybody and then I use the analogy, it's like promising everybody an automobile but then building it by hand instead of doing it the way Toyota does it. It's not going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Our fourth and final panelist for this first panel is going to be Ruth Meinzen-Dick, who's a senior research fellow with the Environment and Production Technology Division at IFPRI, or International Food Policy Research Institute, and she's been there for about 10 years. Her research deals with water resource management, property rights, and collective action. Much of her fieldwork has been conducted in South Asia and Southern Africa, and her recent publications focus on, among other things, agricultural research, livelihoods and poverty, gender and collective action in the context of agriculture and natural resource management, irrigation institutions, and water rights.
Thank you. When I was first looking at this title that we had discussed and coming up with the presentation, I kept reading it as necessary nuisance, necessary nuance. And I think what coming last, I guess I have the advantage and the disadvantage that a lot of the key points have already been made. So maybe I'm going to focus on some, getting into some of the nuances then, which are not what are coming across in the media and in many of these discussions. I won't spend a lot of time recapping the background issues, but just to point out some things that are often neglected in especially the media accounts is there's this conflation between foreign, without distinguishing whether that is by governments or by private investors. In particular, Japan, in response to this brief that IFPRI issued last week, there have been a number of questions from the Japanese media and others saying, why are you saying Japan is making these investments? It's largely private companies from Japan rather than sovereign investment there. Again, in IFPRI's analysis, the 2008 food price increases really did play a factor in this, as well as the lack of confidence in world food trade. And so particularly Joachim von Braun, Director General of IFPRI, is keen to highlight the importance of restoring world confidence in world food trade in this. One of our estimates was that approximately 15 to 20 million hectares have been under negotiation or confirmed since 2006, if you go by all the different media reports. That's approximately either the total area of farmland in Germany at the lower end or France. So it is significant, but as other speakers have pointed out, a lot of these deals have not been confirmed, and the media reports fluctuate a great deal. Now, there are some very important opportunities in this. Certainly, we've just heard about the importance of increased investment in agriculture. So what can that do? It can create both farm and off-farm jobs, as well as the much-needed development of rural infrastructure, roads, certainly ports, as well as investment in social infrastructure in rural areas. Schools and health posts have often been promised as part of foreign investment deals. Resources for new agricultural technologies are certainly needed in many countries. Here I want to point out, though, that straight importation of agricultural technologies from the investor country to the host country often don't work because of different agroecological conditions, as well as even socioeconomic conditions. So one critical question is, to what extent are the investors willing to work on agricultural technologies that are adapted for the local conditions, not just the way they're used to growing crops? The other opportunity that's often cited is the possibility of future global price stability if we can increase production enough. And that also possible increased food availability in the host country of if production really does increase due to this greater foreign investment in agriculture. Now, on the other side, there are also, serious questions and threats involved. The first that Alexandra has already alluded to is the very uneven playing field in the negotiations. And there's several players in this, not only the investors, and their governments may or may not be involved, and the host country government, but also the local people in the host country who's have been occupying and using the land, in some cases for decades, in some cases for generations. And what bargaining power do each of these players have in these negotiations about this? That applies not only at the point where the deals are being negotiated, but also in the enforcement of those deals. There are many reports of, not only in the case of agricultural investment, but other types of investment in, say, mining or oil and natural gas, where the investors have promised schools and health clinics and things like that, and then they don't deliver those. Well, what is the ability to enforce the agreements once those are put in place? The other major threat is the question of eviction and loss of land for people who have been using that land. And this is particularly an issue in Africa, where much of the land is under customary tenure. So on the books, if you only look at it from a Western perspective, it is largely state land, and you only have to negotiate with the state, the government, and then they can reallocate this. But in fact, there are local people who have had very strong customary rights on this, and who then do object to being evicted from their land. And that's been part of the reason why this has touched a lot of nerves. And then the other major threat is the environmental problems of bringing in large-scale agriculture in some of these areas. Large-scale agriculture works relatively well in the Midwestern U.S., where you've got a nice homogeneous environment, where you've got a highly heterogeneous environment. Large-scale agriculture is not as well adapted. You have to tailor it to the various ecological niches. And this takes a lot more skill and attention. So rather than polarizing this and saying good or bad, what I really think is important is that we ask critical questions about each case. And that's what I want to focus on here. So the first question I would ask on any case is, what is the current land use, and who are the current land users? Now, there's a lot of talk about empty land. Actually, I don't know many places where there is empty land. And if it is not currently being used by people, there is probably a good reason why it isn't. And that may be, it is possible that there's just a low population density, but very often it is land that is not suited to agriculture, or that is a high biodiversity area and is therefore in some way protected by that. Much of the unused land is on long fallow rotation systems, and that is because the soils do not sustain intensive monoculture as a sustainable manner. Then there are the questions of who are these users. I've already alluded to the fact that in many cases there are people who have been using the land but do not have clear ownership rights. So you have to look at what is the current land tenure, including customary rights And my own personal concern is with common property rights, because very often that is the land that is the easiest to reallocate. I was part of a panel at the International Association for the Study of the Commons Africa meeting where it was on commercial pressures on the commons, because often rather than reallocating land that is under private use, it's easiest to reallocate the commons, because usually that is registered as state land, even though communities may be using that for both grazing, firewood, a whole host of products. Again, those products often don't go through the market, so they haven't been counted in the state records, so again, it looks like it's empty land or not used land. Then you look at what are the proposed land use patterns here. And, well, I'll come to that again a bit more in the discussion of ecological conditions. In general, the International Land Coalition, which is a coalition of intergovernmental organizations, including FAO and IFAD and World Bank, and civil society organizations, is compiling some work on this, and they distinguish two general patterns between Africa, where these processes are going on, where it's a reallocation of customary land, versus Latin America, where it's purchases from private landowners, and it's more of a consolidation there. So again, looking at what are the proposed land use patterns, and especially what are the likely livelihood outcomes for the local people. And here, I want to talk a little bit about the extent to which you have an alignment of interests between the investor, the host government, and the local people. Where you can get that alignment, I think you're going to get a sustainable investment in this, and it's that win-win process. Where you don't have an alignment between those interests, that's where you've got problems coming up. So the first question to ask in there is, are there really going to be net benefits from this? Do you have a realistic expectation of how much is going to be produced from this land? And how does that realistically compare with what's actually being produced, marketed and non-marketed on that land now? Then, assuming there are benefits, what proportion of those are going to go to the investors, to the government, and to the people? In some of the cases that have been alluded to, what is being paid by the investors is going to the host government for port facilities or something like that. And while that may be important, if the local people are not deriving a benefit from that, then you can expect protests. But then, what are the kinds of local benefits we could expect? Is there a direct payment, either buying their land or a rental payment? Are they getting employment? Are they getting either roads or other facilities, health clinics or things that they value? Or are they getting markets for what they produce? Is this creating opportunities for them to sell at higher value? And I think all of that comes down to what are the kinds of contracts that we are talking about. Is it a total land acquisition, or is it contract farming at the other extreme? And in general, in the terms of the agreement, an outright expropriation of the land leaves the least for local people. Sale gives them a one-off income, but then if they don't have good opportunities to reinvest that money, it may disappear quite quickly. Rental gives an annual flow of benefits, so that is at least an income stream. But contract farming actually may give the most sustainable benefits to the local people if that can be arranged, because they then maintain their land. And that's, there's often a value to just having your land as a part of your identity that transcends just the economic value, especially as outsiders may value it. I think I've already alluded to some of the questions of the ecological conditions of whether this proposed land use would really be sustainable. You have to look at that very critically. And I think some of the cases that have been talked about perhaps have not done as much of the looking at the long-term sustainability of this. Another key question is the degree of transparency and local involvement in negotiations. I think this was one of the major problems of the Madagascar deal that fell through last year, was because they did not have the transparency. In fact, when we were getting some media queries about this case, I tried to contact people I knew who were working on land tenure in Madagascar, said, look, could you take these? And they said, no, we have children who are going to school here. We don't feel comfortable in answering questions about this. That was the level of lack of transparency and even fear going on. So, you know, if this isn't above board, then you do kind of ask questions. And I've already pointed out the problem of enforceability. What, actually, let me go back one point about on ecological conditions. It's not only what's happening with the land and the biodiversity on that land, but also water. We've heard a number of points about the water is sort of driving this, looking for places where there's water available. And especially in Africa, it's certainly true that there is not a lot of irrigation. You could expand irrigation there. The one question whenever you expand irrigation is, where is the water coming from as well? Who is it being diverted from, or are there environmental flows that are being diverted? And that has often been one of the constraints. In the IFPRI policy brief that's outside, we do call for a code of conduct that, and Joachim von Braun refers to it as a code of conduct with teeth, would be necessary. And certainly we do have movement toward developing such a thing. The African Union has come up with its own policy guidelines on this. And World Bank is involved, FAO, there's discussions going on this. Some elements that, in reviewing these cases, that we think would be really important in it is, first of all, transparency in negotiations, and certainly whether local people are involved, with the aim of meeting the standards of free, prior, and informed consent. And there's very detailed international law on that. Respect for existing land rights, including customary and common property rights, not just titled private property. Issues of sharing of benefits, especially with local communities, and issues of environmental sustainability, very serious environmental impact assessments to be done, and then adherence to national trade policies, so that in a year of severe food shortages in the host country, the foreign investor would not be able to export all of the food. Providing that guarantee would, we feel, be important to even improve the acceptability of these kinds of arrangements and the long-term sustainability of them. Now, codes of conduct are fine, but they don't go very far on their own. They just sort of exist out there. You would also require an international system to enforce that code. There are standards, for example, that EU imposes on bribery, which says that a foreign company that conducts business with bribery can be sued in their own country, in the EU, for example, so that you have some kind of an enforcement on that. You want governments to monitor and safeguard local people's rights. So there's a role of an international system. There's a role of the host state governments. There is an important role of the media in increasing transparency. But it is also important that the media researches this and puts out reliable studies and not just inflating stories one way or another. And I think there is an important role for civil society to keep the pressure against deals that are unjust or do not meet concern for local people. I want to just finish with a parallel process that I remember watching quite closely 15 to 10 years ago, and that was with the building of dams. I was working on water resources a lot, and there was building of a lot of large-scale dams. And when that was being done, it was said that's a higher value use, and there's these people, and they may not have firm land rights. We'll evict them to flood that area to build the dam, because that water will then irrigate and create prosperity. All this. There was a growing international outcry against this. I remember seeing protests just down the street in front of the World Bank at the time. And it led to both World Bank policy and finally the World Commission on Dams that created standards for equitable treatment of local people who were losing their land to this process so that they got a share of the benefits. I think some kind of a process toward that, yes, it did increase the cost of the dams. And you can say that it slowed down the building of the dams. But on the other hand, the dams that were built can proceed more stably without these kinds of winds of protests. So I think some kind of a movement toward that, where you get this meeting of interests and an equitable sharing of benefits, leads to more stable long-term investment in agriculture in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Well, I imagine that some of you may have questions, and I will get to them right now. I have some, but I'll defer them because I'd like you to ask yours first. Quickly, briefly, please wait until a microphone comes. There'll be one on each side of the aisle, or each aisle here. And please keep your question, and I say question singular, brief and succinct. So let's start on this side of the room. Did you have your hand up, sir? Yeah, wait for the mic.
Thank you, Michael. My name's Howard Mann. I'm with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and Michael has actually allowed me 1 minute, no more than 1 minute, for a shameless plug of a paper that we had hoped to present here, but we've left an abstract out on the front desk, a publication entitled "The Thirst for Distant Lands, Foreign Investment in Agricultural Land and Water." It provides something of a synopsis of the kinds of issues that were talked about here, but perhaps with a greater focus on the integration of land and water issues than has been developed here so far, really looking at the issues together. It also takes a somewhat different perspective in that we look at the issues some way as a commodification of land and water for investment for foreign agricultural purposes, or long-distance farming, if you will. And the reason for that is not just that it's a nice soundbite, but that's because how international economic law looks at these specific issues. And the second part of the paper deals specifically with the issues of international economic law, in particular international investment law, coming from international investment treaties and the international investment contracts for investment in agriculture. And how do they relate to the domestic law and the international level of law that applies to these issues? What are the structures that come out of it? What happens when domestic legal systems are incomplete or deficient in terms of addressing the kinds of social and environmental and human rights issues that were raised earlier? What role does the international economic law play from its perspective in determining the outcomes of those issues and potential conflicts? So the paper addresses those issues and tries to raise them and identify them in a preliminary way, at least, given the absence of actual agricultural contracts to really have a significant look at. But hopefully it will make a contribution to the debate and understanding of the legal elements, and in particular the international law elements that overlay the domestic law that applies here. While I have the mic, if I might just make two quick comments on the speaker's points. One, in terms of the notion of a code of conduct, and in particular enforceability of it, it seems to me this is extremely important, and the issue of enforceability is critical, because we do have hard rights that come out of the contracts for the investors. We do have hard rights that come out of international treaty law for the investors, and creating a system where that kind of code of conduct, where the other elements are equally hard rights from the other perspective, is critical, because if they aren't, they simply don't play at the same level. And so it becomes critical how any code of conduct relates to the legal system. And that's where the role of the contracts is a central element. You have to get these things linked up right with the investment contracts, or you end up with a skewed set of rights that are hard rights and obligations or responsibilities that are soft obligations. And I think, Alexandra, if I may, I think you've mellowed in the last couple of years. In your presentation, you talked about leaving space for developing country interests in terms of national policy. It seems to me that ought to be the starting point, is the developing country interest, not leaving space for it where international interests predominate. But what are the national country interests first, and what role can international agriculture, can foreign investment play in developing those national interests is really the more hard-nosed, harder-edged kind of approach that we need to take. Thanks very much.
Just to respond, don't worry, Howard, I haven't mellowed, and don't let my outfit fool you. My earrings are mild today, but I still wear the big activist earrings, and it depends on the space. But no, I think your point is very well taken. And it's part of the reason why I also said that any kind of policies need to be framed in the context of rights. You start with that, start with the normative approach, and then link back to the economic policies that would promote that approach. And so the space part of it, for me anyway, does in fact, and I'm sorry I wasn't clear about that, national development priorities taking precedence, as well as norms, and then leading into what kind of investment we want based on that.
Okay, a question right in the front, down here.
Derek Barley. I used to work for the World Bank, and I wanted to just make a comment to Gary and then talk a little bit about the work that we have been doing recently. Gary, you say small-scale agriculture equal hunger, and then you say the World Bank invests in small-scale agriculture because socially and the donors want it and so on. I think you're completely misrepresenting the World Bank and representing the role of small-scale agriculture. I would encourage you to read the World Development Report of 2008. It clearly lays out why it's important to invest in small-scale agriculture. It is the solution to hunger and poverty, and there's a huge amount of evidence on that. And you quote China. How did China get to where it is? China invested back in the 70s and particularly in the early 80s with the household responsibility system, set its small-scale farmers to work, gave them the incentives, and that was what really developed China, not only in terms of reducing rural poverty, but providing the kick-starting the industrialization process. So investing in small-scale agriculture is efficient and it's good in terms of poverty and hunger. And I'm surprised you see at the same time you're defending U.S. farmers with over $500,000 getting subsidies and handouts from the government. It really seems to be a contradiction of terms. I've left the World Bank, but I'm still involved in a very ambitious study, I should say, to look at what's happening on large-scale investments in land acquisitions in developing countries. And I think the main thing that we want to get out of that is evidence, because I think almost all the speakers saying we're debating this, and there's a lot of forums going on around the world, many workshops, but we really don't have the evidence on the ground. So we're working with a number of organizations, including FAO, in about 25 countries to try to find out what's happening on the ground. It involves field surveys, approved large-scale investment projects. What are they growing? Under what conditions has land been acquired? It involves economic studies of the profitability of these investments, social impact assessment, and environmental impact assessment. I wish I had more data to be able to present to you, but it's just getting underway. But just a couple of things that I think are coming out of that already from some of the early results.
Try to keep it to 1 minute or less.
Yeah. One is that biofuels, I think, are probably the #1 driver we're seeing in many countries. It's not that the food security is important in some countries, such as Sudan, but I think biofuels would be probably the #1 that we're seeing in Africa. And secondly, in terms of capacity of countries to be able to handle these investments, I think a number of speakers have been able to alluded to that. But there's some very simple things that we're doing in this study that I think can really help promote the dialogue. And one is just putting these acquisitions in a geo-reference format to see where there are overlaps with community land rights. I think that's been very helpful. So hopefully in a year's time we'll be able to come back to you and tell you a bit about that.
I don't need to say too much. Derek and I have this debate often, and we happen to disagree. I tend to be more in agreement with his former colleague, Paul Collier. And certainly if you wanted to eat in 1970s China, I'd prefer to do it today.
Okay, next question. Let's go to the back. The woman in the blue shirt.
Thank you. Sarah O'Connor, Financial Times. David, a question for you. You talked a little bit about a code of conduct. Is the FAO actually working on one? And if so, how would you foresee the enforcement of it?
The answer to your first question is no, we're not working on a code of conduct. We are interested in this. I think, as Derek just pointed out, we're kind of trying to find out more about what the impacts and so on are before we know what would be the key elements of a code of conduct. I alluded to a number of them as I see them now. We are working, well, my colleagues in the land division are working on some related, not a code of conduct so much as voluntary guidelines on land use, land acquisitions and so on. That work is going on, and I think I've seen some media reference to that. But although we've had discussions and talked about the formulation of a code of conduct for the kind of investments that we've been discussing this morning. I wouldn't say we were formally working towards one in the way that some of the other agencies have been doing so far.
Okay, let's go to the gentleman sitting right next to the last question.
Jerry Hagstrom from the National Journal. I can remember in the 1970s when I guess we had a ban on soybean exports. There was a lot of talk about the Japanese investing in soybeans in Brazil. Does anyone on the panel know if this happened in the form of investment we're talking now, and how that has gone? I'm just wondering about that. And then secondly, do you see any difference between whether it's really a foreign investor going out and doing one of these projects versus, let's say, a big beer company acquiring land within the same country for the production of barley or whatever goes into the beer?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, you know, Jerry, that certainly was the rationale for the Japanese investing in Brazil, was the 1973 soybean embargo. And as was noted on the, I think, David's presentation earlier, certainly that came through this past year with countries banning the export of certain commodities. That is a limitation in the WTO, which the Japanese, to their credit, have been pushing for a fix on. I think the more interesting development actually on Japan of late has been, there's a certain irony that they have small-scale agriculture, huge net food importer, the Koreans also, and yet they're buying large tracts of land elsewhere because they weren't willing to do the hard social stuff internally. They actually have begun that policy change now, Korea as well, and so that should we should start to see greater efficiencies in those countries. But yes, certainly shortages create investment. Personally, I don't know. I'm sure others on the panel would see a difference, but I don't see a difference in your second scenario, except for the beer has a defined output.
Okay, let's take two questions in the back there. In fact, why don't we take them together?
My name is Jimmy Mannon from Voice of America. And why does this international forum not address the land grab by domestic groups? This is only foreign investment into host countries. But another urgent issue is probably land grab by domestic groups in countries where the legislative and law enforcement system is still weak. Case in point is the palm oil industry development in Indonesia. That there was a land grab of virgin land, and where the forest fire create environmental hazards, even affecting Singapore. Does the panel know anything about whether there are some steps being done toward this issue?
Okay, and we'll take the next question.
Hi, my name is Andrea Ries. I'm from the Swiss Development Corporation. I would like to learn a bit more about the process. We've heard that FAO is working on voluntary guidelines, and in your presentation, Ruth has outlined the rather complicated or demanding institutional requirements which would allow sort of a code of conduct to function. And you also made the parallel to the International Commission on Dam. I kind of wonder, where we stand in such a more complex institutional arrangement at the moment. It seems different agencies are doing different things and different actors are doing different things. And to what extent do you think the Commission on Dam is a good example, because the type of investors, as we heard, are a rather complex bunch of private companies, sometimes foreign wealth funds, so it's maybe a bit more complicated setup than we had in the dam issue. Thank you.
Why don't we take the domestic land grabbing question first? And let me just say that I alluded to it briefly, that we probably need another half-day conference to address that issue. But no? Okay. Second, the other question?
Okay. One group I'll point you to, Rights and Resources Initiative, is looking at forest land rights, and they do take up both the domestic and the international issues, specifically with a concern with the biofuels issues. And I can give you contacts there if you want to follow up on that. In terms of the different actors doing different things, yes, in many ways this is more complicated than the situation with the dams 15 years ago. But I think the useful precedent on that was the process of bringing together the different stakeholders, and specifically the civil society groups with government and international groups. I think in this case, certainly private investors would have to be involved in this as well. And creating the dialogue, it wasn't easy. It hasn't always been enforced. In fact, I'm involved with some people who are looking at this 10 years down the line. But at least that process of dialogue was more constructive than just the oppositional things that were going on before that. And I think right now we're at that stage where we're getting opposition without a lot of sound evidence and without a lot of dialogue going on. And it may be that process of dialogue is one of the really important things we need out of this.
Okay. Yes, Sarah, with your hand up, the yellow tie toward the middle of the room.
My name is Joe Domask at the Foreign Service Institute. It seems like the code of conduct can be codes of conduct can be relatively easily developed and are being developed, and many are probably in place all over. A lot of investors will probably be eager to show that they're following those codes, but there's always going to be a good percentage of investors that don't care and won't follow those codes, and it seems like more effort could be focused on developing domestic institutional capacities to handle those investors that aren't eager to embrace codes or be proactive in social and environmental responsibility. So the key would be developing the host country institutions and capacities. Is that a new focus now, or I know that's always been there to some degree, but is there more effort being put toward those efforts?
Yeah, I think you've made a point which I think is pretty close to my personal opinion, which is the important thing is to strengthen national capability and capacity to police these kind of investments. And I think someone referred earlier to, I think it was Alexandra actually, to these disjoints in the negotiating process between the international investors, governments, and then the people actually affected by the investments. And it seems to me that one of the major disjoints there is actually within the countries. And stronger national authorities would solve that problem to some extent. I would like to go back very briefly to, someone mentioned Japan. The Japanese case in these investments is a very interesting one. And it was mentioned that in the 70s and also in the 80s, and there was a lot of Japanese investment in Brazil. In fact, there's a much longer history of Japanese investment than that. But within Japan, at least, a lot of those investments were regarded as being not entirely successful. And speaking with representatives of the Japanese government recently, it's interesting the philosophy that they are now applying to these international investments, where they are thinking much more in terms of supporting the development of developing country agriculture more generally, in the hope that productivity are raised, which will then add to production and trade possibilities in the world from which Japan might benefit indirectly. And there is also much discussion within Japan where these investments are concerned about Japanese control and policing of these, in a kind, almost like a kind of national code of conduct for responsible investments abroad.
Okay, question right here.
My name's Natalie Park. I'm with the Century Foundation. And I've been studying agriculture and land investment in conflict and post-conflict settings. And a lot of times these settings are actually ideal for investment because they need the development, and the land has been fallow for a long time, and the civilian population is also displaced. But the problem is that same civilian population is not able to act or advocate on their behalf, and a lot of times the host government isn't willing to, depending on the extent to which they've actually had a hand in the conflict, isn't willing to act on behalf of the local population. So in this instance, I'm wondering what body has the responsibility, the oversight responsibility for investment in these situations? And I guess that's especially for Mr. Hallam, who said that the host governments do have the onus of responsibility generally.
That'll have to be the last question.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's something I can't really offer you any insightful answer on. It's again, it goes back to this general problem that I mentioned about disjoints within countries and responsibilities and for negotiation of these kind of deals, and the neglect in some countries of stakeholder interests within the domestic population.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to end here. We're going to have our coffee break, and please do stay for the next panel, which will start promptly at 11:20. So please join me in a round of applause for our panelists.